Shalom, shalom. It's great to be here with my colleague and friend and chavrusa, Rabbi David Kasher, who is the director of Hadar West Coast. And
a chavrusa now for 20 years?
Almost 20 years, yeah, starting in Israel. And I've really been enjoying your Parsha podcast. Really, it's writing. You're writing about the weekly Parsha for many years, but this year, all the more so. And many people experience divinity in nature, divinity in relationships and the like. And one of your explorations this year that's been inspiring for so many of us is experiencing divinity in language. What an interesting project. But let's take a step back. What has been your relationship, your journey of your relationship of the divinity of Torah over your spiritual life?
Right. That's a huge topic, yeah. Or at least it felt to me like the big topic when I first went off to yeshiva, when I was in that environment. And you're trying to, you're a young man and you're trying to figure out who you are, and people are kind of throwing ideas at you, and it's it's a religious context. And maybe you would think that we would talk about the existence of God, but we very rarely talked about that. What was the critical issue was believing in the divinity of the Torah, that the Torah was from God. That was more important, that there was a God, whatever. If you don't believe that, you're not even in the conversation. But it was this idea that you had to really believe that the Torah, every word of it, was from God as received by Moses at Mount Sinai at a certain moment in history. Everything, you had to believe that thing, or else you were basically out. That was the sort of yeshiva environment that I started in. And then by the time, I got to yeshiva with you, it's like a modern Orthodox, maybe there's different ways of conceiving of how the Torah comes from God and how the message was shared. But always in the background, there's this kind of looming threat of this other theory, the critical theorist, the documentary hypothesis, this idea that no, actually the Torah is not from God, and they discovered that it's a historical process or is cobbled together from lots of different sources and edited over. And it's you sort of had to fall on one side or the other of that. I remember feeling in my early yeshiva days, and it was really try to believe that the Torah is absolutely true and every word of it is from God, or break down and have to admit to the historians. And the truth is, I think that was a really big issue once upon a time, and I think over time that dilemma faded because I sort of realized that neither side was really able to prove their case. You know what I mean? There is no proof that the Torah is from God, and there's also on the other side, these are, it's a documentary hypothesis. These are theories, and we don't know how the Torah was put together in the most historical sense. But meanwhile, studying it again and again and reading through it over the years, I came, in the midst of all of that debate and trying to figure out where I landed ideologically, just the process of studying the Torah itself brought me to a place of feeling this is divine. In a different way, not in a historical or a factual or mathematical way, but a divine in the sense that it is the sublime work of art. It is the greatest thing, the greatest composition ever composed. And I realized that I might think that, Moses or Bob Dylan, were channeling the divine. Why wouldn't I think, or I said Moses, Mozart. And I think Mozart's channeling the divine. Why wouldn't I think Moses was channeling the divine? Just if you have just the sheer beauty, the sheer brilliance, the sheer artistic intricacy that the Torah offers, which has been stimulating enough as to provide, constant material for study and reflection for thousands of years. There's something about this book that is so well written that it deserves another read every year. And that in itself, I think, over time, shifted my perspective on the whole question of whether or not the Torah comes from God. It's clear to me now that the Torah is a thing of God, and the historical questions are so much less important than the the artistic questions. Yeah.
That's so fascinating. Yeah, that if we experience Mozart or Dylan or other artists as tapping into something beyond the human realm, being able to channel something from beyond, some energy, some brilliance, some chidush, some creativity that never existed, in some ways that encapsulate brilliance. Like, why would we not, at the very least, see that within the power of the most popular book in the history of the world?
Well, yeah, and like I just think of Moses as the person who channeled God more than anyone else ever has. I mean, that is sort of our position in this tradition, that Moses was the ultimate prophet, and like artistic expression, and artists will sometimes speak of it that way, has a kind of a touch of prophecy to it, that you've been like moved by the Spirit to say something, to put something out. And I just think of, Moshe as like the ultimate version of that. Like, and in that sense, it becomes very easy to believe in the divinity of the Torah. I experience it as a work of divine beauty, and I have this story of this guy who once had this experience and came up with this, and that makes sense to me.
What's an example of a poetic expression or just any verse in the Torah that feels to you like it conveys that artistic brilliance and beauty and power of divinity?
Well, I'll give you one verse. You said any verse, and there's a verse right at the beginning of Sefer Shemot, of the book of Exodus. Just as they're kind of setting the stage, we're leaving the family book of Genesis, and we're heading into the kind of people building book of Exodus. And as those people start to grow, the Torah says, "Uvnei Yisrael paro v'yirbu paro v'yishratzu v'yirbu v'yatzmu b'ma'od ma'od v'timalea aratzotam." That the children of Israel were fruitful and swarmed and multiplied and increased very, very much, and the earth became filled with them. So you can you probably even hear in the English "fruitful" and "multiply." Like, I've heard that before, and yeah, you use the phrase "be fruitful and multiply," and it's a direct callback to the Garden of Eden, the very first blessing that God gave to people. But now they were fruitful and they multiplied, but they also swarmed. So and that's also Eden language. Like, they were growing rapidly, not just in the regular way. So they sort of borrowed from the language of the creeping things which swarm in Genesis. So now they're growing at an alarming rate. Maybe that's part of why Pharaoh and the Egyptians saw them as a threat, because they were like swarming. You have a feeling of them looking at them like vermin or something. And then there's the double b'ma'od ma'od. Like, once you're tethered back into the creation story, so then you're using that language, and then when you use very, very much, you're reminded of that sixth day of creation when God called the person Tov Me'od, very good. So there's and now so that was the original creation. Those are the original people. This is a new creation and the birth of a new people, and they will be, if Adam and Eve were good, these people will be very, very good. And it's just that sort of textual wordplay, like one book calling back to another book, but reshuffling the words in order to draw from the meaning of the old story, but infuse it into a new story. It's that's just one verse, but the level of complexity and sort of cross-referencing and just sort of playful, brilliant creativity, and it's like verse after verse after verse of that. But that's one that comes to mind.
Very interesting. Yeah, I mean, I know some people don't like religious texts because they feel that sometimes they're not clear enough. What's it stand on this? But I think the power of being able to constantly reinterpret, make those new connections, and through not just ideas, but through language and how language has already been used to be able to make those new meanings. And you've been a master at exploring that with us.
Well, and like you say that, and it's like, language is, after all, the medium through which our tradition says the world was created.
Right.
It's the medium through which our tradition says God self-reveals at Mount Sinai. What does God do at Mount Sinai? God doesn't show us an image, because that's not our religion. God speaks. God creates words, and those words stay with us. It's clear from the start that the Torah is interested in language and sees language as a foundational, kind of a building block for all of existence. And so why wouldn't language be the medium through which we understand that creative force that is God? And that's sort of what the Torah is there to say, is that you can access the divine through a collection of words, through the linguistic medium, like the world can be created this way, and you can get back into like the origins and the source of that creation through the very words that were used to create the world. So there's something like about that theology that's sort of like deeply embedded in our creation.
So why language? I mean, you're a master of English, you're a master of Hebrew, you speak sign language. I don't know if you say speak sign or you sign. You sign. But why? I mean, religion could have said silence. I mean, Torah could have said silence. It could have said touch. It could have said language is empty. Right? Why do you think language, and to build off that, is language adequate? Meaning, is human experience deeper than language can ever convey? Or is language really have the full potential to convey the depths of truth?
Yeah, I mean, so that, there's like two questions here, and they're both really important, but they're very different answers. I mean, I'll give you the like thumbs up language answer, like why language, yes. And I think that, look, it's the thing which distinguishes us, at least on some level. You can think of a parrot, but like spoken language is the thing that distinguishes us as creatures. Like when in the Torah Adam is created and it says that God v'pach ba'pav, God breathed into our nostrils nishmat chayim, the breath of life. The Uncless translation there is ruach mamalala, like a spirit of speech, and it's like we are speaking creatures. That's sort of what is special about us. Yes, there's like our minds and our consciousness, but that's the only way you have access to it is through our speech. So there's a way in which this is the thing which makes us who we are, and so that's in some ways definitional, and so it's going to define everything. It's going to define our laws. It's going to define our culture. It's going to define our art, and it's going to define our spirituality. But I also think that there's something about language that is, the Maharal says something like this, that language is it's the medium which is somewhere between the physical and the spiritual, because it's made through a physical organ, but it becomes something which is, I mean, we know about sound waves now, but it's like almost intangible and then eventually fades. So like mediating between the physical us and the spiritual God, the one thing we share is this like kind of neither physical, neither spiritual thing, which is language. So that's like, those are a lot of the reasons why language becomes the sort of the thing that we would use to connect ourselves, because we are human, and also because like there's something about this that's a little beyond the animal part of being human and into the kind of godly. Like our language is part of what makes us that imbues us with a touch of divinity. But I will say that it's also true that, the other thing you're suggesting is true also, which is that it's as fundamental to our tradition that language is ultimately insufficient, and that language is just a tool, but that the deepest truths can't even be contained in language and in letters, and like that we know these names of God, and that's as close as we get. Sometimes we even hesitate to speak out a name of God, because like that's getting very, very close to the thing, and yet it's not the thing. It's not ultimately. God is beyond language and beyond words, and so and so it is with all the, not just the names of God, but the whole Torah is a way of pointing at something, of like alluding to something. It is much more like a poetic form of expression than a textbook kind of expression. It's like a way of evoking something that you cannot possibly speak about. So you use metaphor, and you use imagery, and you use wordplay, and you use to try to get at that, even the name of God. And this is like kind of like a kind of a 101 Hebrew of the Bible thing. But the name that we use for God, which I'm thinking of it because we don't pronounce it, right? The Yud Hey Vav Hey name. We don't pronounce that name, and because we're hesitant to ever fully try to speak out what God is, that in itself is a kind of a powerful thought. But the name itself, if you look at it, is kind of like a mashup of the verb to be. It looks like it should be like the verb to be is Haya, it was, Hoveh, it is, and Yehiyeh, it will be. And if you take that Yud Hey Vav Hey name, it sort of looks like all of them together. And there's another way that the Torah is like, and you're not even supposed to pronounce it. You're just supposed to look at it and think about the one who was, is, and will ever be. Mm-hmm. Like that's the name of God in the Torah. It's the one who is, was, and ever be, but you don't actually say it out loud. And all of that kind of linguistic intricacy, creativity, playfulness, sophistication, like that level of encoding and embedding is, it's funny. It's like I used to struggle with the questions of like, is the Torah really divine? Does it really come from God? And now I'm like a Bible code guy. Now I'm I feel like I have unearthed so many layers of the Torah's artistry and sophistication that now my working assumption is, show me more. Like there's more here than I have uncovered. So I have become a believer, but not in the it's been proven to me sense, but more in the like I have experienced in the process of reading and chanting and learning and going through this Torah again and again and again. That's the closest contact I have with God, and that's how I know.
Wow. Just to pick up on your previous point about the adequacy of language, I feel like I've always thought it was my own weakness of my communication skills, my own lack of intelligence, that I just can't communicate and convey what I want to convey over and over, but it is kind of fundamental to language, even though it's perhaps our greatest tool. And part of what the Torah can offer people like me, us, is that language can be used to convey the inadequacy itself, to convey the wonder beyond what we can't communicate. And so maybe more consistently, rather than being confident in my expressions, I can use my articulations to kind of convey there's something so far beyond that I'm experiencing, beyond what I'm actually communicating to you right now. Mm-hmm. And that kind of humility and wonder within our communication process. Mm-hmm. And the Torah, like you're doing, is doing that over and over. But going back to divinity, I'm not going to ask you what your belief of God is. But what do you mean here by divinity in Torah? Meaning, God is like the most powerful and the most empty word. It's the most empty because a Hindu, a Protestant, an Orthodox Jew, a secular person, they literally mean nothing the same when they say the word God. Mm-hmm. But it's also so full because I think it does invoke for us collectively like a sense of something mysterious beyond us. Yeah. But when you talk about the divinity you encounter, the divinity you experience within, like when you have a powerful moment of experiencing the language of Torah and how it's interconnected and how it's revelatory, like what do you think of it in that type of divinity?
Yeah, I mean, look, thanks for letting me off the hook because like anyone, I would stumble in trying to actually define my conception of God or my experience of God is hard to put into words for all of this talk of language. So I'm glad not to have to do that. But I do think that what I am pushing and experiencing myself and trying to share with others is an experience of studying the Torah, experience, and I don't even want to say study because that's too intellectual. It is intellectual, but it's more than that. It's experiencing the Torah is it's a spiritual practice, and like our encounter with these words in this way, and maybe you believe me and you agree with me and you think like it's because they're perfect words, or maybe you just think like no, the tradition has developed a kind of discourse that makes it a spiritual experience to study in this way through our midrashim and commentaries and the connections that people have made. But whatever it is, we've created a kind of a spiritual practice, like in the way that some people meditate. we meditate over the Torah. And it brings us to a state of mind, a state of consciousness where we are, where I am at least, I will speak for myself, like more in touch with that central force that is unnameable. Like that's part of what we mean when we say God is one, is that it's all just one underlying thing that is like too big to actually, identify or enumerate. So that's like what Torah is a kind of a meditation on these words and on this language, in order to achieve a kind of meditative state, a kind of a higher state of consciousness. And I think that anyone who has, there are lots of ways to achieve that state of consciousness. There's lots of spiritual practices, but the case I'm trying to make for the Torah is that if you've ever been to a museum and just like stood in awe in front of a painting and felt like a sense of connectedness to some higher force that isn't just about the artist, but is about some other thing that the artist has tapped you into, like that's what I'm talking about with Torah. And I'm talking about it, at least my experience is like on the highest level of encountering a kind of sublime beauty and perfection that just makes you think like, oh, well, this is tapping into something, like this is connected to something higher. And you don't have to take my word for it, like people have been saying that about this particular work of art for thousands of years. So it's it's worth a look. And it's worth a look, I must say. That's a very lofty note. I'll end on a much more prosaic one, which is that you do need some Hebrew to appreciate this. Right. So I want to make a plug for Hebrew learning, but the bad news is you really don't get the beauty of the Torah without Hebrew. The good news is you don't need a lot of Hebrew. You need like a working understanding of the alphabet just so you can go back and forth and like look in the English what it says in the Hebrew and just start following the three-letter roots of Hebrew words, and it will change your study of the Torah. It will change your study of the Torah. And I think a lot of us have had this experience where we like grew up and we heard these stories and we read this and maybe we even got to know the Hebrew, but it wasn't until we started making these connections that we started to realize like, oh, this isn't just something we have to read because this is our tradition and, I like these parts and I don't like these parts. But this, we actually have like, the Mona Lisa plus the David plus the, Starry, Starry Night plus all of the greatest works, the greatest book ever written,
So if you're making a plug, I'll also make a plug that if you've never tried Shnai Mikra, to consider doing this. And if you reading the Parsha each week, and multiple times, maybe even with a commentary. And if you don't want to study it, you could actually read it with them in a meditative state. Read the language, but in an elevated state of consciousness, as opposed to an analytical one. Or maybe you could do both at the same time. I can't.
And you're welcome to sign up for my weekly Devout Torah at hadar.org.
Yes, no, seriously, you should really check that out.
The Shnai Mikra is probably a better idea.
That's awesome.
I'm happy to help along.
All right, here's my very last question for you. So my very last question for you is, how can this translate into our enhancement of a social discourse today? Which is to say, whether it's a theological commitment of Torah Sinai, Torah Shemayim, whether it's an artistic, experiential understanding of the divinity of the language of Torah. So, okay, over there, we can study Torah and we can experience that. But in the language every day we use in our families, in our workplace, on social media, how might we experience the capacity for language differently after encountering divinity of the language of Torah?
This is like sort of back to where we started, because it reminds me of some of those, big questions that we were asking about, the Torah's not just divinity, but sort of veracity, legitimacy, like provability as a divine thing. And I think that a lot of those debates that were swirling around in my early yeshiva years were debates that had to do with literalism. That was the idea.
Yeah.
And what's so crazy is that like we were being pushed to believe in a very literal, like believe in the simple, plain black and white truth of the Torah, every word. And the other side also was being trained to think of religion literally. Yeah. Religion claims the world was created in 7 days. That's right. We just proved it isn't. The whole thing is bunk. Right. And it's like, but once you start to read the Torah, you realize like this is the way that this book is using language is so far beyond literalism. It's not that it's like not true, it's just, it's not true in that sort of simplistic, basic, like every word means exactly what you think it means kind of way. It's like it's a way of using language to summon something that is impossible to describe. And yet, you know, this book has done a pretty good job of centering a character who you can never see, who you don't really understand, and yet, like, this book's version of that character has been the one that has most imprinted itself on human consciousness. So there's just that's a lesson that there's something foolish about reading our spiritual text the way we would read a microwave instruction manual, you know? Like, this is not like just a matter of getting the words right and seeing if they correspond to, like, I don't know, you know, your other textbooks. Like, this is an attempt to use language to get somewhere, to transcend. And
for social discourse today, how does that...
Well, I just think that, you know, everybody is so deeply attached to their version of the truth.
I see, yeah.
And they really feel like they have the truth.
In a binary fashion.
And I think that, like, our religion's relationship to language suggests that, like, there are truths. We believe in truths, capital T truths, but they are so far beyond us. And our ability to access them is something that is so difficult that sometimes we refrain from even pronouncing the words that we think express the true thing. Like, there's a kind of humility, even as we embrace language, there's a humility in realizing the limits of language or any other human capacity to really access the deepest truths. And I think we could use a little more humility on all sides of our cultural spectrum these days.
Yashikoach.